Hello. It's time for Zecher Lemaaseh Bereshis. And since everybody's mind is on Pesach already, so even though we have many more very interesting lizards to do, we're going to skip lizards for the next 3 weeks, and we're going to concentrate on Pesach, and we're going to do Svardeya, frogs and toads. And they are amphibians. They're not really reptiles, they're amphibians, which means that they are animals that live part of their life in water and part of their life on land. There are not too many animals in that category. There are frogs, toads, salamanders, and a couple of strange creatures called sirens and Sicilians. There are about 3,500 species of frogs and toads in the world that Hashem made, so far that they found. And the largest in the world is called the Goliath frog. He lives in West Africa. And his body is as much as a foot long and 7 pounds. And of course, when the feet are outstretched, it's much bigger. The biggest American frog is the bullfrog. And he gets to be as big as 8 inches body, and with his legs stretched out, he's about a foot long, 4 inches. In South America, there's a toad called the rococo toad, who also grows to be 10 inches long. And there's a toad, Bufo asper, which reaches 8 inches. The smallest frog is a frog in Brazil, which is only about 1/4 of an inch body size. Now, what everybody wants to know is, what is the difference between frogs and toads? So, I don't know exactly when this was, but in Europe, which is where they started to give English names to them, so there were only two species that were known. They were well known at all. There was what was called the common frog, which was a moist, slimy creature that jumps. And there was the common toad, which is dry, with a warty skin, like little bumps all over its body, and it walks, it doesn't jump. So after this, every new species that was discovered that was in that category, either a frog or a toad, so they just put them into that category. If he was slimy and he jumped, and he was moist, had a moist body, and he jumped, then they called him some kind of a frog. And if he was a dry skin, which had these warts on them, these bumps all over them, and it walked, then they called it a type of toad. Hashem designed most frogs, which rely on their leaping ability to catch their food and to get away from their predators that want to eat them. He provided them with long, powerful legs, whereas toads, which don't move around that much, they're designed with short hind legs. Now, the top picture I'm going to show you is a South African bullfrog, which is 8 inches and very aggressive. As a matter of fact, he charged and tried to bite the photographer who took this picture. And the picture on the bottom is the biggest toad in Asia, called the Bufo asper. Now, we're going to study the designs of the body of the frogs and toads, which show Hashem's great wisdom and power. The kindness of Hashem we will see in their usefulness for mankind, as well as their important role in maintaining a balance of living creatures in their environments. However, the greatest lesson of Hashem's power was shown in Mitzrayim, when he brought forth at one time and place uncounted millions and maybe billions of leaping, croaking Svardeya, frogs and toads, out of the Nile River during the second Makkah. They entered the homes, the baking and cooking pots, the ovens, the bedrooms. They were everywhere in Egypt, except in Goshen, where the Bnei Israel lived, to teach the lessons of Hashem's power to the Egyptians and their paro, so they would free the Jews in order that they could come to Har Sinai to accept Hashem's Torah. Their constant loud croaking and their overwhelming numbers caused Paro, the king of Mitzrayim, to beg Moshe and Aaron to remove them. So on this, I'm going to show you a picture of one of the smallest frogs. This frog is less than an inch. It's actually, the picture is much bigger than what its size really is. And then you're going to see the common frog of Europe and the common toad of Europe, which is the basis for the whole difference of categories between frogs and toads. This is a really very small frog, and this is less than an inch long. Of course, the smallest of them all is about half of that, and so the picture is much bigger than what it really is. This is the common frog of Europe, and this is the common toad of Europe. The interesting thing is that Hashem gave a tiny example of his power in Orlando, Florida in the 1980s. What happened was that one night they discovered that all their streets and driveways were covered with spade-foot toads. There were so many of them, and they were all squished against all the glass doorways. Everybody had homes with sliding glass doors. Well, there were hundreds of these toads that were there trying to get in the doors, trying to get in the house. Of course, in Mitzrayim, they didn't have glass sliding doors, and they couldn't keep the toads and the frogs out. And they really were totally covered and overwhelmed with them. But anyway, what happened in Florida at the time was the weather was very unusual. Usually there are small ponds that dry up during the dry season. They didn't dry up that year. There was so much water. And therefore all the tadpoles, all the baby that comes out of the eggs, they turned into toads. And then a heavy rain came from a big storm, and it caused all the baby toads to get out of the ponds all at the same time, and onto the streets and the driveways they came. Now this is a picture of a frog that looks like he's just going to jump on you. And that's the way it looked to the Mitzrayim. Now, the Mitzrayim, so every Mitzrayim had hundreds of thousands of frogs that looked like this, about to jump on them. This is actually not one of the frogs that was in Mitzrayim, because this is an American frog. This is a leopard frog. Now, the power of Hashem is seen in many ways with frogs, but one of the most amazing examples of Hashem's power is the ability he gave frogs and toads to change from one type of creature, a water-living fish-like being, into an air-breathing land animal. Now, this process is called metamorphosis, and this miraculous development is only seen in frogs and toads and salamanders, and a different type of metamorphosis of butterflies and moths from caterpillars. Those are the only creatures Hashem made that he showed this power, and it is an amazing power. Then the eggs are laid in water. They look like as little dots, little black dots, inside a clear jelly-like mass. And that jelly has three purposes. It's to keep the eggs from sinking to the bottom. They're safer on the top, and they get oxygen from the air, which is what they need. And the jelly also acts like a magnifying glass, which concentrates the rays of the sun onto the eggs to keep the eggs warm. And thirdly, when the tadpoles come out of the eggs, so then they have this jelly to eat. That's their food. After they finish the egg yolk that they had, the yolk in their egg, now they have the jelly to eat. That helps them for a few days for food. So anyway, after a few days to a week, tadpoles are little wriggly creatures that hatch from the eggs. And they have fish-like bodies. They have no legs. They have no lungs. They live in the water, and they have gills like fish. These gills, you'll see a picture of them sort of in a minute. And they basically are like fish. They take oxygen out of the water through the gills. Now, after eating the jelly mass that they hatched from, they eat on algae, this plant that grows on the water plants. 1 to 2 months later, all of a sudden, out come hind legs out of the tadpoles. Then, another miracle, front legs grow. And then the tail starts to disappear slowly. It gets shorter and shorter. It gets absorbed into the body. And then, really a great miracle, all of a sudden, they grow lungs inside their body, and the gills disappear, and they start breathing through their lungs. The tail disappears, almost completely absorbed into the body. They get larger, and eventually they become full-size frogs or toads. The eggs are laid in early spring. The metamorphosis is usually complete by midsummer when they hop out on land. Now I'll show you two pictures. This one shows they came out of the eggs, and now they look like little kidney beans. And this one. And this picture, if you look closely, you can actually see these little white fringy things. That's actually their gills that they're breathing through in the water. It brings the oxygen from the water into their body. And they, what do you call it? Eventually, soon after that, actually the skin covers it. The skin grows and covers it like a flap over the gills. But in this picture, you can still see them. And here is some pictures of the whole development of metamorphosis. You can see here, that's the eggs that were just hatched. Not hatched, but whenever they were laid. And they just, each one, a bunch of black dots. It's in, you can't see it, but it's in jelly all around it. Here is where they're beginning to form already. They actually have heads and tails already. At 7 days, that was at 3 days. At 7 days, they already have gills and muscles and other organs they have already. At 9 days, the gills and the tails are well developed. At 10, just a day later, all of a sudden you see their eyes and the tail is like whip-like. It changed in 1 day. Look at how different the tails are. Now this is a bullfrog tadpole. It's well developed. Now here you see the tail is starting to get shorter and shorter. And he also developed some hind legs. And now he's got almost everything. He's got his front legs, his back legs, his tail has almost disappeared completely. You see his eyes are on top of his head already. And these are all miracles. I mean, it's really incredible how Hashem makes this, that they develop like this. Now another inyan of the power of Hashem is the power of hibernation. That when it gets cold, the frogs and the toads that live in cold places, they have the ability to slow down their heart rate, their breathing rate, their respiration rate, and other body processes, and to go without eating and just sleep for months through the winter. There are other animals that Hashem does this with. He does it with quite a few mammals. He does there's even a bird or two that does this. Certainly a lot of reptiles do it, and the frogs and toads do it. And it's an amazing process. So through the winter, when it's too cold for them to live, or there's no food to eat, or both, so they just burrow down a foot down into the mud, and they go to sleep. They wake up in the spring when the insects are just hatching their main food, and when the air is much warmer. Now the frogs and toads that live in the tropics or the subtropics, like in Florida, they have warmth all year round, so they don't need this miracle of hibernation to survive. Okay, we'll stop here today, and we'll continue next week on Sfar Deya. Good Shabbos.